Moving on. Articles. Articles are a self-contained post, perhaps a news article, perhaps a story, blogs, anything that seems like it's a self-contained chunk of content that could stand on its own, perhaps on its own page even, but happens to be included on a page, maybe with other pieces of content. That qualifies as an article. In fact, article is a special type of section. It's got all the same properties and attributes a section does, in that it can also contain a header and a footer and its own navigation. So let's go ahead and do a simple exercise where we take a blog post and update it to use a few of these new semantics. I'm going to go to Jeremy Keith's blog where he wrote recently about watching and keeping up with HTML5. He says, full-time job if you're subscribed to the boast all these mailing lists. It is a lot of work. But we're not here to read the content of his blog, which is quite excellent. We're here to look at the source. So if we look at his source, we do a view source, we can see that, aha, he's even putting some comments for us. He says, I see you want to peek at the source code. It's a great thing about the web, reverse engineering. I don't know about you, but this is how I learned a lot about HTML, which is view source, and then copy, paste, and modify, and teach myself things. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's start with Jeremy's body here, or body tag at least, and copy a little bit, perhaps down to just before the main content. And let's copy that over to our document here with our nice HTML5 doc type and meta charset. Paste that in, and go ahead and figure out, well, okay, we've got this content. What are the new semantic elements that we just discussed could we add here? One more thing about section. I said articles are a special type of section. The body is also. The body tag is what we call another sectioning element. So that means you can include a header and a footer and nav inside the body element, and they maintain all those same semantics. So clearly here, he's talking about a logo, and his navigation and all that. This is all material that belongs inside a header. So we can put a header element there. And how far down does it go? Looks like all of this content belongs in the header. So let's go ahead and do that. And what else can we add? Okay, he's got a logo, has pictures. Here's the nav. Here's a perfect example of where you could add a nav element to indicate semantically that this section contains navigation links. Great. What else could we do? I think for just this part of the content, that's good enough. We've added a bit of semantics without having to actually change in the existing content at all. And in fact, notice that around the navigation, he's already got a div tag, which he's using with the ID of navigation. That's okay. We've got a nav tag, he's used ID navigation, 6 of one, half dozen of the other. Let's go back to his source and keep looking. What else is there here? Here's the main content. Oh, great. That's the section we're looking for. So let's copy from there down to, let's see, how far does the content go? Keeps going, keeps going. It's a good long blog post. And this looks like footer type material. He's talking about the time. Why don't we go ahead and trim it there? Copy that. Go back to our source code view, put some space in, paste that in. Okay, here's the main content. Now, in HTML5, there really isn't a tag to indicate main or main content, despite the fact that this is a very commonly used concept across web pages. What it came down to is there weren't any specific significant semantics added by something being called main. In this case, if we want, we could perhaps use the section element to indicate, okay, well, this is a major section of content. Let's call it a section, right? So let's call that a section. Oh, wait, however, well, what do we have here? We really have a blog post. Now, in HTML5, as in HTML4, you ought to use the most semantically precise and appropriate element for the specific use case. In this case, an article, which is a special type of section, is actually more appropriate because this is an article. So let's go ahead and replace that section with an article. Great. Now we've got an article here, and let's mark up the specific pieces of it. We start with, looks like the header and the heading. The heading's already marked up, so let's just mark that as a header of the article. And now we've got his markup in the article itself. I don't think there's anything there that we need to touch. Great. And here at the bottom, it's the timestamp for when the article was posted. This is the kind of information you would find in a footer. So let's go ahead and mark that up as a footer. Great. And now we've added a little bit of HTML5 semantics to Jeremy's blog post. There's a few more semantic elements that have been derived from common usage. One of those is the aside element for, like you would think, tangential comments, perhaps side content. You know, you see a magazine article that has a main article, maybe has a little sidebar of content or articles. You can use it for things like that. I think this element used to be called sidebar, but that has such a presentational connotation to it that over the course of discussions in the working group, they came up with the term aside, which is a nice, non-presentation specific semantic name for this content. It's pretty good. It's not going to apply probably in a lot of situations, but if you do post blog posts or articles with tangential content, little side notes, the aside element is what you want to use there. The next new semantic element that HTML5 introduces is hgroup. And hgroup is meant for many situations where you end up actually clustering headings, like a heading and a subhead, and you want them to be semantically connected together. So let's take a look at an example that we had from before that actually had a heading and a subhead, which we already started to mark up with some of the additional HTML5 semantic elements. This is from the title of this video, which is HTML5 Now, step-by-step video tutorial. Obviously, it's a heading and a subhead. In this case, all we need to do to use the hgroup element is to wrap the whole thing in hgroup and close hgroup. What this indicates is that semantically, the two headings are linked. And so if a browser or some other user agent, maybe a search engine, maybe an indexer, is going to display, like, say, an outline of the document using the headings as keys into the outline, it's telling that program that these two headings actually belong together and shouldn't actually be separated out into separate levels or separate sections. The nice thing is, all these new tags, they're actually already stylable in modern browsers. Well, for the most part, except for Internet Explorer, unfortunately. Internet Explorer up through version 8 does not allow styling of these new elements because it doesn't recognize them. However, as of Internet Explorer 9, current preview, we're able to style all the new semantic elements that I just described to you, which is great news. It means that hopefully in a few years, you'll be able to actually depend on them. Well, we don't have a few years, or rather, we don't want to wait a few years, so we're going to use a technique that we've had to use as web developers and designers in the past, which is nested divs with semantic class names. In this case, though, rather than using nested divs to work around box model problems, which is one of the original reasons that this technique was developed back in the early 2000s, we're going to use nested divs to keep the semantics in two places, fortunately next to each other, with the new tags, like article, for example, and using a div with that same element name, or at least something similar as the class name. So this technique that we're using here, we're doing because we want the markup to be recognized by both new modern HTML5 browsers and still work with existing browsers, and is really employing a technique that's one part of what I would call bulletproof HTML5. This notion of bulletproof web development and web design was really first introduced by Dan Cederholm in his book, Bulletproof Web Design. And it's really taken off quite a bit because people understand what it means to build web design that works across a variety of situations, whether or not a feature is supported, whether or not a device has a certain resolution, depending on window size, etc. So depending on the area, the overall methodology is still the same, which is to allow for flexibility in the user's environment and to essentially bulletproof your design to make it work across more environments. In fact, this technique was applied to the realm of JavaScript and Ajax as well. Jeremy Keith published a similar book on bulletproof Ajax, where he describes how to create nice dynamic websites that use Ajax to update portions of the screen that gracefully degrades even in browsers without JavaScript, that work in browsers without JavaScript, specifically by making sure that whatever you code for creating those dynamic areas, you also code to properly handle the content if you have to generate everything on the back end. So this technique we're showing you here will work whether or not you have HTML5 compatible browser or not. So what you have to do, like I said, use the nested div, and then the key piece is using the CSS to style the div that's nested rather than the element itself. Styling .article instead of just article itself. And that'll work in all modern browsers. So from a CSS perspective, because you can't depend on these new elements being styled across all browsers, you have to style the inner div. So let's take a look at one of our examples, like the H group. If I want to style that H group reliably, what I should do is instead put a whole div around this whole thing. Div class equals H group, similarly. And the easiest thing to do is just to pick the same class name as the element itself so that it's obvious, both to you and to anyone else that's maintaining the code, what you're doing. This bulletproof HTML5 technique. And there you go. If we want to style that H group, we would use the class selector as shown here in the presentation.